What happens when forbidden love spirals into obsession and murder? It's the kind of story that starts with a look, a moment that lingers, igniting emotions neither person expects to feel. In the peaceful suburbs of Maplewood, two lives collided in a forbidden affair that would lead to violence, betrayal, and ultimately death. Linda Hargrove, a 51-year-old housewife, seemed to have it all. A comfortable home in a quiet neighborhood, a steady marriage to Richard, a well-respected local businessman. But Linda's life was not as perfect as it appeared. Beneath the surface, she struggled with loneliness, yearning for something more than the predictable life she had. Jason Miller, on the other hand, was a 19-year-old man, fresh-faced and full of youthful charm. He had recently moved in next door, and it didn't take long for Linda to notice him. What started as simple neighborly pleasantries turned into something darker. An innocent conversation sparked a dangerous attraction that would lead to a scandalous affair and, ultimately, murder. It wasn't long before Linda's affair with Jason took a fatal turn. What started as passion quickly turned into obsession, jealousy, and violence. The shocking murder of Jason Miller would send ripples through their tight-knit suburban community, leaving everyone questioning how such a seemingly perfect woman could fall so far. But the true horror was yet to come. The small suburban town of Maplewood seemed like any other. Nestled just outside the city, it was a place where the lawns were meticulously manicured, and neighbors greeted each other with a smile as they walked their dogs or sipped coffee on their porches. Children played on quiet streets while families gathered in their backyards for weekend barbecues. Maplewood on the surface was the epitome of tranquility. But beneath this idyllic exterior, things were not always as they seemed. There was a secret that lingered in the corners of the neighborhood, a secret that only the most watchful eyes could discern. The houses, though pristine, were filled with hidden struggles, unspoken desires, strained marriages, and lives quietly unraveling behind closed doors. Linda Hargrove lived in one such house. Linda's life seemed perfect, at least from the outside. A comfortable home with an immaculately kept garden, a well-dressed husband, and a reputation for being the ideal wife. But beneath her poised exterior, Linda was deeply dissatisfied. She had married Richard Hargrove, a successful local businessman, when she was young. At first, their marriage was full of excitement and promise. Richard was charming, attentive, and devoted. But as the years passed, the spark between them began to fade. Linda felt like she was slowly becoming invisible, her days revolving around housework, church services, and the occasional social gathering. Richard, though kind, had become distant. He spent long hours at the office and rarely paid attention to the loneliness that crept into Linda's heart. She yearned for something more, something thrilling, something that would remind her she was still alive. Linda's life had become a series of predictable routines, and she had come to realize that she had become a stranger to herself. She often found herself staring out of the window, watching the world go by, wondering if there was more to life than what she had. She went about her days with a kind of practiced cheerfulness, always ensuring everything appeared perfect. She had friends, she attended social events, and she kept up with the local gossip. Yet in her private moments, Linda knew she was missing something. The passion, the excitement, the sense of being truly seen, all of it had faded into the background of her daily existence. As Linda poured herself a cup of coffee on that seemingly normal morning, she had no idea that her life was about to change forever. It was a typical Thursday morning when Linda first noticed him. Jason Miller, the young man who had recently moved in next door, was standing by his mailbox, staring at the pile of letters he had yet to sort through. He was tall, with dark hair that fell just a bit too long over his forehead, and a lean physique that suggested he spent more time in the outdoors than inside. His boyish face was framed by a pair of sharp blue eyes that were far too mature for someone so young. Mature, Linda had seen Jason before, of course. He was the new neighbor everyone was whispering about. The town was small, and newcomers rarely went unnoticed. But it wasn't until that afternoon that something in the way he stood there, staring off into the distance as if lost in thought, caught Linda's attention. There was a vulnerability in him, a certain sadness that mirrored her own unspoken dissatisfaction. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned away quickly, pretending not to notice. She wasn't sure why, but something about him stirred an unfamiliar feeling inside her, a mixture of curiosity and intrigue. It wasn't until the next day that she saw him again. It was late in the afternoon when Jason knocked on her door. Linda, who had just finished tidying the house, answered with a smile. "Hi, Mrs. Hargrove," Jason said, his voice smooth yet tentative. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I just moved in next door, and I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Jason." Linda invited him in, offering tea and a warm smile. She had always prided herself on being a gracious host, and something about Jason's politeness made her feel appreciated in a way she hadn't in a long time. As they talked, Linda found herself drawn to Jason's youthful energy. He spoke with enthusiasm about his plans to settle into the neighborhood, and there was a charming sincerity in his words. She was surprised by how easy it was to talk to him, how his presence seemed to fill the empty spaces in her life that Richard's absence had left behind. Jason was like a breath of fresh air, a stark contrast to the monotony of her daily routine. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, and Linda found herself laughing at jokes she hadn't laughed at in years. There was something thrilling about being seen by someone like Jason, someone who was so full of life and possibility. She didn't realize it then, but that first conversation would mark the beginning of a dangerous descent. The days that followed were filled with casual encounters. Jason would stop by while taking out the trash or watering the plants, and Linda would invite him in for a drink or a quick chat. At first, everything seemed harmless. Jason was just a friendly, outgoing young man, someone to fill the empty hours of Linda's day. But over time, their interactions began to shift. There was an unspoken tension between them, a growing awareness that neither of them was willing to acknowledge. One evening, as the sun set and the air grew cool, Jason came over to ask for some sugar for his coffee. It was a simple request, but as Linda handed him the jar, their fingers brushed. The touch was brief, but it felt like an electric shock, a spark that ignited something deep within her. She quickly pulled her hand away, her pulse racing, but Jason didn't seem to notice. He smiled and thanked her, but the atmosphere between them had changed. That night, Linda lay in bed, her mind racing. The touch lingered, and so did the memory of his eyes on hers. Soft yet intense, like he was seeing her for the first time. A week later, Linda couldn't ignore it any longer. She was walking to the mailbox when Jason appeared in his front yard, his gaze immediately locking onto hers. He smiled, a slow, confident grin that sent a shiver down her spine. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said casually, "I was wondering if you'd like to join me for a walk. It's such a beautiful evening." It was a simple invitation, but it felt loaded with possibility. Linda hesitated. She wasn't sure why, but the idea of spending time alone with Jason felt both exciting and dangerous. She told herself it was just a walk, nothing more. She had nothing to lose. "Sure," she said, her voice unsteady but eager. As they walked down the quiet suburban street, the world around them seemed to fall away. They talked about nothing in particular, just simple, light-hearted conversation. But with every step, Linda felt the distance between them closing. She could hear his breath, the way he laughed at her jokes, the warmth of his arm brushing against hers. It wasn't long before they stopped at the small park at the end of the street. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. They stood there in silence for a moment, and Linda couldn't help but notice how close Jason had gotten. He was standing just inches away, and the air between them felt thick with unspoken tension. Then, without a word, Jason reached out and gently cupped her face. Linda froze, her heart racing. She wanted to pull away, to tell him this was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Jason leaned in, and before she knew it, his lips were on hers. It was soft at first, hesitant, but then it deepened, and everything in Linda's world shifted. The guilt, the fear, it all melted away in that single moment. She had never felt more alive, more desired. The kiss was everything she had been longing for, and she gave in to it completely. As they broke apart, Jason's eyes searched hers, full of something darker, something possessive. But Linda didn't notice. She was lost in the thrill of the moment, the intoxication of something forbidden. The days that followed that fateful kiss seemed to blur together in a haze of stolen moments and secret meetings. Linda's life, which had once been predictable and safe, was now consumed by the forbidden pull of her affair with Jason. It started with the occasional stolen glance, a lingering touch, and whispered words shared in the privacy of her home. But soon it wasn't enough. They began meeting at night, when the world around them was asleep, when they could exist in their own bubble of secrecy. Linda would slip out of her house pretending to take a walk or visit a friend, but she would always end up at Jason's place, or they would find a secluded spot in the park, hidden by trees, where they could indulge in their passion without fear of being caught. The adrenaline of their secret meetings fueled the affair. Each encounter brought a new rush of excitement, a thrill that seemed to override the guilt that gnawed at Linda's conscience. She had never felt more alive, more desired than when Jason was with her. His touch, his voice, the way he looked at her like she was the only woman in the world, it was intoxicating. Jason had a way of making Linda forget everything else. The mundane responsibilities of her life, the nagging dissatisfaction with her marriage to Richard, and the lingering fears about what this affair could mean. For the first time in years, Linda felt wanted. She felt beautiful, and she couldn't get enough. But as their meetings became more frequent, something darker began to surface. Jason wasn't just the charming young man Linda had first met. There was an undercurrent of possessiveness that slowly seeped into his behavior. At first, Linda had brushed off Jason's increasing need for attention as nothing more than youthful passion. But over time, she began to notice small signs that something wasn't quite right. He would show up unexpectedly at her door, insisting that he needed to see her, even when she hadn't invited him. His jealousy became more apparent, especially when she would mention any interaction with other men, even in passing. One afternoon, Linda was chatting with her neighbor, Margaret, outside her house when Jason appeared at the edge of the driveway, his eyes locked onto her like a hawk. Linda noticed the slight tension in his jaw, the way his hands balled into fists at his sides. "Hey, Linda," Margaret said, waving her hand in greeting. "How's it going?" Jason didn't say a word. Instead, he stood there, his gaze fixed on Linda, his lips tight. Linda quickly made an excuse to go inside, feeling an uncomfortable tension hanging in the air. As soon as they were inside, Jason slammed the door behind him. "What were you talking to her about?" Jason demanded, his voice low and strained. Linda was taken aback. "Jason, it's nothing. Just small talk. Why are you—" "I don't like it," he interrupted, his eyes darkening. "I don't like seeing you with other men." Linda's heart skipped a beat. There was an edge to his voice now, something possessive and controlling. She had never seen him like this before. "Jason," she said softly, trying to ease the tension. "We can't. This can't continue. It's not healthy." But Jason didn't listen. Instead, he stepped closer, his body almost pressing against hers. And for a moment, Linda forgot her doubts. His eyes were filled with a hunger she couldn't ignore, and despite the nagging voice in the back of her mind, she kissed him again, giving in to the rush. It wasn't the kiss that disturbed her. It was the feeling that followed. Jason's intensity was growing, and Linda began to feel like she was no longer in control of the situation. She tried to dismiss the thought, telling herself that this was just another phase in the affair, that things would settle down. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. Jason was no longer the charming young man she had fallen for. He was becoming someone else, someone darker. Over the next few weeks, Linda's life became a delicate balance between her public facade and her private affair. Every time Richard left for work, Linda would find herself sneaking away to meet Jason. Their secret trysts became more frequent, more desperate. Jason's behavior continued to shift, growing more possessive with each passing day. One evening, Linda returned home to find a note slipped under her door. It was from Jason, written in his neat handwriting. "Why didn't you tell me you were going out with Richard tonight? I didn't know where you were." Linda felt a cold shiver run down her spine. There was no return address, no signature, just those haunting words. It was as if Jason had been watching her. She tore the note up, trying to push the growing unease aside, but the doubt remained. Jason's jealousy reached a new height when he learned that Linda had been spending time with her old friend Greg, someone she had known since her college days. She had been hesitant to tell Jason, knowing how he would react, but Greg had reached out, and she hadn't been able to ignore the opportunity for some innocent companionship. It had been years since Linda had connected with anyone on that level, and the conversation with Greg had been a breath of fresh air. But when Jason found out, his reaction was violent. "I told you I didn't want you talking to him," Jason yelled, his face flushed with rage. "Why can't you understand that I'm the only one who matters?" Linda tried to calm him down, but the confrontation left her shaken. She had never seen Jason like this before. His anger, his desperation. It was all too much. And yet, despite everything, she couldn't pull away. She was trapped in the whirlwind of their affair, caught between the heady excitement of being desired and the fear of what Jason was becoming. Linda could feel the weight of Jason's obsession pressing on her. What once seemed like thrilling passion now felt suffocating. Jason's possessiveness had gone from subtle jealousy to outright control. He began showing up at her house at the most unexpected times, knocking on the door when she wasn't expecting him, and always demanding to know where she had been, who she had been with, and why she hadn't told him everything. There were no more casual conversations, no more innocent moments. Everything had become about him, his desire, his need to have her completely. One evening, after a heated argument about Jason's latest outburst, Linda sat on her bed, staring at her phone. Jason's messages were growing more erratic, his words becoming more desperate. He wanted more of her time, her attention, her life. He made it clear that she couldn't see anyone else, that she couldn't live her life unless it was with him. The weight of the situation began to sink in. Linda had always been the one in control of her own life. She had always been the one who made the decisions. But with Jason, that control was slipping away. She had tried to break things off more than once, but each time Jason had pulled her back with his charm, his promises, his declarations of love. His manipulation was subtle at first, but now it was impossible to ignore. One night after Linda had rejected Jason's advances, telling him she needed space, he showed up at her door. He was uncharacteristically calm, too calm, and his eyes were dark, like a storm waiting to break. "Linda," he said softly, his voice eerily steady, "if you don't choose me, I'll make sure Richard never gets in the way again." Linda froze, her blood running cold. "What are you talking about, Jason?" He stepped closer, his breath warm against her face. "I can't live without you. If you really care about me, you'll help me. We can be together forever. You just have to do one thing, just one thing." Linda's heart pounded in her chest. "Jason, what are you saying? I don't want to hurt anyone." But Jason's expression remained unchanged. "I'm saying Richard has to go. You have to make him disappear, Linda. It's the only way we'll ever be free." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Linda could feel her stomach twist in knots. She didn't know if she was hearing this correctly, if this was some dark fantasy of Jason's that he had been harboring. But the look in his eyes told her he was serious. Jason's obsession had gone too far. He was no longer just a young lover, desperately seeking affection. He was a man whose mind had been consumed by a dangerous, twisted desire. The thought of Richard, her husband, getting in the way of their future had become an obsession in itself. Jason no longer saw Richard as a person, but as an obstacle, a hurdle that needed to be removed. Linda tried to reason with him, to talk him down, but Jason's mind was made up. The idea of a future together, free from the constraints of their double lives, was all that mattered. He wasn't going to let anything or anyone stand in his way. Linda sat on the edge of the bed, her head spinning. She had never felt more trapped in her life, but deep down she knew something had to change. This affair, this madness, could not continue. But Jason's words, his cold certainty, echoed in her mind. She had never seen him like this before. "Jason, I don't want this," she whispered, barely able to speak through the lump in her throat. "I can't do it." Jason's face twisted with frustration. He grabbed her arm tightly, pulling her to her feet. "You don't have a choice," he hissed. "If you love me, you'll do what I say. If you don't, I'll make sure you regret it." Linda's heart pounded as Jason's grip tightened. She had never been afraid of him before. He was the man who had given her excitement, the young lover who made her feel alive. But now he was someone else, a person who was capable of violence, of dark, twisted thoughts. The man standing before her wasn't the charming Jason she had once known. He was someone she no longer recognized. Her mind raced. She couldn't do this. She couldn't kill her husband. No matter how unhappy she was in her marriage, no matter how much she wanted to escape it, she could never take that step. Richard was not the enemy. He was not the one who had betrayed her. But Jason's words, his anger, his desperation, sent a chilling wave of fear through her. He wasn't going to stop. He wouldn't let go. What if she didn't do what he wanted? Would he harm Richard? Would he destroy everything she had worked for? The next few days were a blur of indecision. Linda spent hours alone in her house, staring at the walls, her mind turning over the words Jason had said. She knew she couldn't go through with his plan. But how could she stop him? How could she escape the suffocating grip of his obsession without risking her own life or Richard's? She tried to reach out to Richard, tried to talk to him, but the distance between them had only grown. She couldn't confide in him. She couldn't tell him the truth. Not about her affair, not about Jason, and she couldn't risk losing her family. Jason's threats, though never direct, hovered over her every moment. She began to avoid him, but he always found a way to reach her. He was everywhere, at her door, calling her phone, leaving notes at her window. His obsession had consumed him entirely, and now it was consuming her as well. The night had fallen quietly, but Linda felt the storm brewing inside her. Every corner of her home felt like a prison now. Every shadow a reminder of the life she could no longer escape. Jason had been relentlessly contacting her, his messages becoming more desperate with each passing hour. She had refused to meet him, but that had only made things worse. She knew it was coming. The confrontation. The moment when everything would change. Linda had tried to shut him out, to put some distance between them, but Jason wasn't the kind of person who would just fade into the background. His obsession, his need to possess her, had only intensified. He couldn't stand the thought of her slipping away, of her pulling away from him. He wanted her completely. He wanted her for himself, and nothing, not even Richard, was going to stand in his way. That night, Linda was sitting alone in her living room, staring blankly at the TV, when she heard the knock at the door. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew it was him. She had been expecting it. When she opened the door, Jason stood there, his face pale and tight with fury. His eyes were wild and his posture rigid, like a predator who had cornered its prey. "You can't keep running from this, Linda," he said, his voice low, almost trembling with rage. "I've given you every chance to make the right decision. I've told you what needs to be done." Linda swallowed hard, her throat dry. She tried to keep her voice steady, but it cracked. "Jason, please. I can't do this. I can't help you hurt Richard." Jason stepped closer, and Linda took a step back, her breath quickening. He wasn't listening. He wasn't hearing her anymore. All that mattered was his own twisted vision of their future. "You don't understand," Jason hissed, his eyes flashing with intensity. "This is the only way. He has to die. Do you understand? Do you get it?" Linda's mind raced. She had tried to avoid this moment for so long, tried to push it away, but now it was here, standing in front of her. She was terrified, but there was no more room for negotiation, no more room for hope. She had to make a choice, and she knew deep down that the choice was already made. Jason wasn't going to leave until his plan was fulfilled. "I can't," Linda whispered, tears filling her eyes. "I never wanted this. I never wanted any of this." But Jason wasn't moved. He grabbed her arm, his grip tight and forceful. "You've already chosen, Linda. Don't pretend like you haven't." Without another word, he pulled her out the door, guiding her toward the car. There was no turning back now. They drove in silence, the tension so thick that it suffocated the air between them. As they reached the outskirts of the town, Jason turned onto a dark, winding road that led to the lake, their usual meeting place. Linda's heart thudded in her chest. She knew what was coming. There would be no escape. When they arrived at the lake, it was eerily quiet. The only sound, the soft rustling of the trees and the distant lapping of water against the shore. Jason got out of the car first, moving toward the edge of the water, his movements sharp and erratic. Linda stayed in the car for a moment, her mind spinning. She didn't know what to do, how to stop him, but the sinking feeling in her stomach told her that whatever was about to happen, it was going to change everything. Jason turned back to face her, his face twisted with a mix of determination and madness. "Get out of the car," he ordered. "It's time." Linda hesitated, but she knew there was no point in resisting. She opened the door and stepped into the cool night air, her body trembling. They walked toward the water's edge in silence, the tension between them palpable. Jason stopped at the shore, turning to face her. His expression was no longer the love-struck young man she had fallen for, but a stranger, a person consumed by rage and obsession. "You've made this happen, Linda," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "This is what you wanted, what you've always wanted." "I never wanted this," Linda replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted any of this." Jason didn't answer. He stepped closer to her, his hands reaching out to grasp her arms. His fingers dug into her skin, but she didn't fight back. She couldn't. Her body was numb, as though she had already accepted the inevitable. And then, in the blink of an eye, it happened. Jason's grip tightened, and with a force Linda hadn't expected, he pushed her backward. She stumbled, her feet slipping on the loose ground, but before she could regain her balance, Jason lunged forward. His hands, once tender and loving, were now strangling her, squeezing the life out of her. Linda's vision blurred as she gasped for air, the pressure on her throat unbearable. She could feel her pulse pounding in her temples, her body fighting against the suffocating grasp of his hands. She tried to scream, to cry out for help, but her voice was swallowed by the night. For a moment there was only darkness, and then, just as quickly as it had started, Jason released his grip. Linda collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, her body shaking uncontrollably. Jason stood over her, panting heavily, his face contorted in a mixture of anger and satisfaction. But Linda could barely process what had happened. She was choking on her own breath, her body trembling, but her mind was numb, unable to grasp the full weight of what had just occurred. Jason didn't say a word. He simply watched her, his eyes cold and distant, before turning and walking away into the darkness. Linda lay there for what felt like an eternity, trying to collect herself. The pain in her throat was excruciating, but it was the emotional weight of the moment that was unbearable. She had watched her life crumble in a matter of minutes. The love affair that had once seemed so exciting, so full of promise, had turned into something monstrous, something she couldn't undo. As she struggled to stand, Linda knew that everything had changed. Jason was gone, but the nightmare he had created would haunt her forever. The air felt heavy around Linda as she stood at the edge of the lake, her breath still shallow from the brutal confrontation. Her mind raced, but her body felt numb, as if she were moving through the motions of someone else's life. Jason had left, but his presence lingered like a dark cloud, looming over her. The moment had come and gone so quickly, but the weight of it crushed her chest. She had watched him walk away, leaving her alone to face the consequences of her own choices. But there was no time to dwell on the guilt. No time to reflect on what had just happened. The clock was ticking, and the reality of what she had done started to sink in. Jason had fallen to the ground, his body unmoving. She couldn't leave him here. She couldn't let anyone find him like this. If the police discovered his body, They would connect the dots, connect her to him, and everything would be exposed. Her secret life, her affair, her betrayal, it would all come crashing down. Panic clawed at her insides. She could feel her heart thundering in her chest, each beat louder than the last, a constant reminder of the mess she had made. Linda turned and stumbled back to the car, her legs unsteady beneath her. She was barely aware of her surroundings, her mind focused solely on the task at hand. She had to cover this up. She had to make sure no one ever found out. The drive back to the house was a blur. The headlights of her car cast long, eerie shadows along the empty road, but the silence inside the vehicle was suffocating. Linda barely registered the passage of time as she drove, each minute stretching longer than the last. When she finally arrived home, she didn't even park properly. She left the car in the driveway, the engine running, and ran inside. Her hands shook as she grabbed her keys and unlocked the garage. She needed something, anything. The familiar surroundings offered no comfort. There was no peace, no sense of security, just the overwhelming urgency to cover up her tracks. With trembling hands, Linda pulled out a large tarp from the corner of the garage, the plastic crinkling under her grip. She dragged it outside and rolled it out on the driveway, her mind fixated on one thing only: getting rid of the evidence. She had no plan, no real understanding of what to do, but she couldn't think about that now. She had to act. Linda went back to the lake, each step heavier than the last. She returned to the spot where Jason's body lay. The night was still and eerily quiet, and for a moment Linda stood there, staring at the lifeless form. A mix of dread and numbness filled her. It felt unreal. She couldn't believe this was her reality now. She bent down, her heart pounding in her chest, and began to drag his body toward the tarp. It was heavy, and the effort was more exhausting than she had anticipated. Every move felt wrong, every breath felt shallow, but she kept going. She couldn't stop, not now. Finally, after what felt like hours, Jason's body was wrapped in the tarp. Linda tied the ends tightly and, with as much strength as she could muster, she loaded the body into the trunk of her car. Her hands were slick with sweat, her mind spinning, but she kept telling herself, this was the only way. This was the only way to keep everything from falling apart. Once she returned to the house, Linda's body was a tense bundle of nerves. She parked the car in the garage and quickly ran inside to change her clothes, trying to wash away any evidence of what had happened. Her breath was erratic, her face pale, but she kept moving. She had to act normal. She had to go on as if nothing had changed. Richard would be home soon, and everything had to be just as it had been before. There couldn't be a single hint that anything was out of place. Linda took a deep breath and looked at herself in the mirror, trying to steady her nerves. Her eyes were wide, her skin clammy with the sweat of fear. But there was nothing she could do about it. No one could know. No one could suspect a thing. As the hours passed, Linda sat in a daze, her mind spinning. She couldn't shake the image of Jason's lifeless body, but she couldn't let herself feel the full weight of what she had done. Not yet. The guilt gnawed at her, but she pushed it aside. She had to keep up appearances, at least for now. She had to pretend to be the woman she had been before, the housewife, the devoted wife to Richard. But Linda knew, deep down, that nothing would ever be the same again. The days after Jason's murder passed in a blur of frantic activity and denial. Linda threw herself into her daily routines, pretending everything was fine, but every moment felt like a performance. She couldn't escape the guilt that gnawed at her from within. It was a constant companion, lurking in the back of her mind, whispering to her that she would never be free of this dark secret. But it wasn't just the guilt that haunted her. It was Jason. At first, she tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, that her mind was playing tricks on her. She had buried Jason's body in a remote part of the lake, away from prying eyes. No one would ever find him. But despite her best efforts to erase the crime from her life, Jason's presence lingered. At night, she would hear footsteps outside her window. She would hear knocks on her door, gentle but persistent. And when she looked outside, There was no one there. The house felt colder, darker, as if something or someone was watching her. Linda's nights were filled with restless sleep, plagued by dreams of Jason, of the struggle at the lake. Every time she closed her eyes, she could feel his hands on her throat, strangling her once more. She woke up in a cold sweat, her heart racing, but no matter how hard she tried to shake the images from her mind, they would always return. Days passed, and Linda began to unravel. Her mind couldn't take the constant pressure. She stopped eating properly, lost weight, and became pale. Her once tidy house now reflected her inner turmoil. The dishes piled up in the sink, and the floor collected dust. Richard noticed the change but didn't say anything. He was busy with his work, but even he could sense something was off. Linda couldn't hide it much longer. She began to believe Jason was truly haunting her. At times, she could almost feel his presence, standing in the corner of the room, watching her, judging her. The guilt that had once consumed her began to take on a more tangible form. It wasn't just in her head anymore. It was real. Jason was there, in the house, in the very air she breathed. One evening, Linda found herself standing by the lake again, the place where everything had gone wrong. The cool evening air wrapped around her like a shroud, but she didn't care. She had to go back. It was the only way to make it stop. Linda knew what she had to do. She had to end this, once and for all. She had to return to the lake, to confront whatever it was that had been haunting her. She had no more fight left in her. There was nothing left to live for. With shaky hands, she climbed into her car and drove toward the lake. The road was dark and empty, but Linda felt no fear. She didn't care anymore. When she arrived, she walked to the shore and stood there, staring at the water. She felt it, the weight of Jason's presence. She couldn't escape it. Without a word, she stepped into the water, slowly walking deeper and deeper until the cold water reached her waist. She closed her eyes, letting the darkness consume her. And then, she let go. Her body was discovered the next morning, floating lifeless in the water. Her eyes open, staring into the abyss. The community was shaken by the tragedy. Richard, the neighbors, everyone who had known Linda was left in shock, unable to comprehend the depth of the darkness that had consumed her. No one knew the full truth. Only Linda and Jason knew what had truly happened on that fateful night. In the end, Linda's story was one of obsession, betrayal, and the crushing consequences of a single choice. Her affair with Jason had led her down a path from which there was no return. It was a story of love turned toxic, of a woman so desperate to escape her reality that she would do anything to keep her secrets hidden, even murder. As we reflect on this tragic tale, we are reminded of the fragility of the human psyche. The cost of our choices can be devastating, and the consequences of betrayal can reverberate long after the truth is buried. What do you think? Was Linda's fate inevitable, or could she have changed the course of her life? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe for more chilling true crime stories.